Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Childcare for federal employees could soon be more expensive and harder to find. DOGE eliminated the GSA office that managed childcare centers in federal buildings. With more on the potential impact on federal workers, the executive director of the Alabama Institute for Social Justice, Lanice Emanuel, joins me now. Lanice, GSA shuttered its childcare office in March. Most people probably don't even know that this office existed, but it was there to provide oversight and accreditation and space to 82 childcare centers located in federal buildings across the country. Your organization advocates for childcare centers. What's the immediate impact of this office closure on federal workers?
Well, here in Alabama, we actually only have one childcare center that is supported and falls under the GSA, which is in Birmingham, Alabama. And so it'll obviously have an impact on that center. But I think for us as advocates for childcare across the state, we recognize that childcare has literally been on life support for many years now. We experienced this most poignantly when the pandemic occurred and all childcare centers in Alabama had been closed except for about 12% of those centers. So in a post-COVID world, childcare is still in a recovery mode, if that makes sense. That compounded with inflation and increased costs around providing care for children, a shutdown like this across the country is literally just going to exacerbate those conditions, whether it's in a federal center or a community center. Childcare is something that is already difficult to access. It's already not affordable. And so we should be investing more resources into childcare and creating more childcare centers. So whether it's on the federal level or at any level, we should not be closing childcare centers at all.
Well, you mentioned the pandemic, and certainly one of the benefits that we saw during the pandemic of remote work was that it allowed for some flexibility for parents of young children. They could be home before and after school with their children, or even all day with their infants if they needed to. And that flexibility is especially valuable for women who are able to remain in the workforce because then they can manage childcare and work together. So now that the federal government is mandating return to the office for everyone, at the same time as they're reducing the availability potentially of childcare centers, what is the impact directly on the workforce?
Well, I think here in Alabama, it really kind of depends upon the types of jobs that some women are able to have. I know in our state, we have a lot of essential workers. So these are people who actually have to go into a facility to provide work or services. And so those folks are not typically as fortunate as others who actually may have the types of jobs where they can work from home. And so we have a lot of essential workers in our state. And so not having childcare is a real issue. I think that the flexibility that happened during the pandemic is something that is meaningful, but I think also when you interview a lot of those women, it can still oftentimes be challenging to actually work from home while you're actually trying to care for children. So I think that this idea that childcare, in essence, is not critical infrastructure, right? I mean, it's not just a luxury. It's literally infrastructure that's necessary in order for our society to actually work.
Well, so one of the things that this office did was to ensure that the federal child care centers meet the accreditation standards of the National Association of the Education of Young Children, and they subsidized the renewal and accreditation fees for these centers that were in federal buildings. A GSA spokesperson recently said that any remaining centers would comply with state quality rating standards. As someone who's been the customer of child care centers in a variety of states, I know that states have very different standards. How do you interpret that guidance to say that now the federal child care centers are going to respond to state accreditation standards?
Well, first of all, let me be very clear. There is a direct correlation between quality and how well childcare centers are actually resourced. So there's a lot of talk about quality, but one of the issues, even when centers are actually licensed or they receive that NACE accreditation, they actually struggle with quality because these centers are not resourced properly. Here in Alabama, a lot of the supplemental funding is really tied to the state's quality rating system. And so that is sort of one set of standards. But NACE really is the gold standard around childcare centers being considered quality. And so the idea that the GSA would actually not provide those resources in order for those centers to at least have NACE accreditation, it's just ludicrous to me. No one wants to send their child to a center that does not have some level of licensing or some level of meeting certain standards. And when we ran a campaign for the child care safety, and eventually it passed, but part of that was around the idea that even nail technicians, are required to have a license. Even barbers are required to have a license. So the idea that we would not be investing basic foundational resources to ensure that child care centers maintain a certain standard, it communicates something. It communicates something to the public. It communicates something to parents. Anything that we're not willing to invest in to ensure safety, basic safety for children, it's not the direction that we want to be going in.
Lanice Emanuel is the executive director of the Alabama Institute for Social Justice. So let's follow that thread a minute. Could this action actually put children at risk?
Well, it most certainly puts children at risk. We've had incidents here in Alabama where church centers did not meet basic licensing standards. We've had horror stories of 80 plus children getting food poisoning. We've actually had reports of children dying in centers. What we know for sure is that having standards, a lot of times centers struggle to get everything right, to check all the boxes, to ensure that every child is safety. But I can assure you that when there is no licensure in place, when there is no accreditation in place, then you've actually increased the risk. You've increased the vulnerability of children. And so we have a responsibility as a society to ensure that our children, when they're in schools and when they're in these centers, that they are actually safe. But there has to be a great deal of intentionality around that. These things don't just happen. And so the fact that even here in Alabama, when we seek to actually give child care workers more funding to support their work, they're actually required to go through many, many more hoops just to get a minuscule amount of money. And so it's a posture, quite honestly. And that posture communicates certain things. I will also go as far to say, given that we are the Alabama Institute for Social Justice, and we do use both a gender and race equity frame in all of our work, this sort of devaluing that we kind of consistently see towards childcare workers and the industry at large, we believe that this kind of devaluing is really tied to this country's legacy of slavery. It is the devaluing of women that goes as far back as that we're seeing as a manifestation today, and how poorly resourced and supported this particular industry is. This industry is the workforce behind the workforce. So I think that when we don't consider them and hold them in the esteem that they're deserving of, once again, we are communicating where our values are and where they are not, quite honestly.
So it's one thing for us to say that the closure of this office and the return of oversight to the states for these federal child care centers actually may put children at risk, but it also has the potential to take away accessibility. About 15% of these centers are in documented child care deserts. People are already waiting 3 years or longer to get into a quality child care center, one of these federal centers in a federal building. If we eliminate these in child care deserts, what does that do for folks who need childcare to actually participate in the workforce?
Well, Alabama has a high percentage of childcare deserts. Let me just also say that. So we're already, once again, in a very vulnerable position. That compounded with the fact that when the reins are sort of handed over to the state, in a state like Alabama, then you're going to get a particular result. Here in our state, there's a lot of focus on the pre-K program, for example, which we are not against the 4-year program, but we do recognize that it's only 1 year in a child's life, and it only serves about 40% of the children that actually need the services. So here again, we need to be investing more in childcare, not less. But we also recognize that the sort of inequitable way that the state approaches childcare, it also exacerbates the conditions of community child care centers, which are the types of centers that would be in these rural areas where they're already experiencing child care deserts. So we are left at an even more vulnerable position when sort of lot is left in the hands of a state that is already in many instances we're not politically aligned with, and the political administration of the day is most certainly, which has dictated this call today, they're definitely not moving in a direction that strengthens childcare or this particular industry.
So, Lanice, we're talking about the GSA office, and that's federal child care centers in federal buildings. GSA doesn't oversee the Department of Defense's child care development centers, but at the same time, DOD is reducing staffing, and the services are announcing that they are having to reduce access to defense-provided childcare. Alabama's got a number of military installations along with your federal installations. This has got to be having a real impact on the workforce in your state.
Well, it most certainly is. I mean, we were already having an issue with workforce in the state, but what's going to happen is when centers that are federally supported are closed, then those same families are going to still need childcare, and they're going to look to community centers to provide that. These community centers are already struggling mightily. As we say, they are literally in crisis mode as we speak. And so the kind of insecurity that's being created around this field is something that seems to be increasing. I recall the day that the president ended all the federal funding. I was literally on the phone all day long with childcare providers panicking because a lot of them get their funding from a federal source, through the money that comes down to the state and is handed out. And even when it's the formula that's used to actually allocate those funds, it's already not enough. And so you're now going to tax a system that's already taxed. So these people will be looking for childcare, and they're going to go to the places that currently provide it. And those places are already dealing with a high attrition and turnover in terms of the workforce. They're already dealing with directors who are over these centers who are actually now having to go into the classroom and actually teach, and they're also not getting paid. You have them reeling from efforts like the ARPA, American Rescue Plan funding that was distributed to the Department of Human Resources here in the state of Alabama, which exacerbated their financial conditions, leaving many of them with very high tax debts that they now have to pay. So you're talking about a system that they're going to turn to, these potential federal workers, that is already very, very taxed. I have really grave concerns, quite honestly, about how this is going to play out because we're already under great strain in our state in the childcare space.
Lanice, thanks so much for helping us understand the second and third order effects below this decision at the GSA. And thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for the opportunity, Terry. I really appreciate it.
Lanice Emanuel is the Executive Director of the Alabama Institute for Social Justice. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, Congress tries to figure out how to do less with less. But first, despite the early firing of 17 IGs, the SIGI agenda